Now, reckless might be what you or I might think about an airstrike on a giant nuclear power plant, and the head of the United Nations atomic watchdog agrees. That's how Rafael Grossi has described the drone attack on the facility at Zaporizhzhia in Ukraine, which has 6 reactors. Now, it's in Russian-held territory on the front line of the conflict, but it's unclear who did it. Hamish De Bretton-Gordon is a defence analyst and a former British Army Colonel. Hamish, welcome to the show. I suppose the big question people are wondering is who's responsible for this? How did it happen?
Well, I don't think at this stage it doesn't really matter who's responsible. I mean, it's absolutely bonkers that a nuclear power station is being used in a military conflict. The Russians, whose military holds Zaporizhzhia, have absolutely no reason to be there at all. And this is yet another example of explosions and attacks on Zaporizhzhia, which is the second largest nuclear power station in the world. People only need to look at the plumes of radiation produced when Chernobyl, a few hundred miles away, blew up in 1986. And that's widely available on X, Twitter, to see that it could cover the whole of Europe. So, I absolutely agree with Signor Grossi that this is madness. But actually, what we need is some action by the UN and the International Atomic Energy Agency. The only way to secure Zaporizhzhia, which in effect the Russians are using as a sort of improvised nuclear device. And I say that advisedly. I mean, there was a report in the Telegraph over the weekend of Russian using extensive use of chemical weapons on the front line over the last year. So to use this as a nuclear device would not be implausible. But what we need is a demilitarized zone around Zaporizhzhia as soon as possible. And that really is where the UN and the International Atomic Energy Agency can come in. And I am sure if the Chinese and perhaps the Indians provided troops to do that, then that would be acceptable. But at the moment, we just can't sit by and let this happen. Although this was a drone strike, one strike is unlikely to create some sort of nuclear reaction, as we saw with Chernobyl or Fukushima. It could produce a chain of events that could lead to that. It's just too dangerous for it to carry on as it is.
Yes, as you say, the stakes are incredibly high. This is a very kind of dangerous situation. You talk about some kind of sort of demilitarized zone around that, but what do you think is the likelihood of that happening, and how much sort of leverage does the United Nations and other international voices have in terms of doing this at this point of the conflict? Particularly, will Russia listen?
Well, you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, the United Nations has become a completely toothless sort of paper tiger over the last few years, which is why others need to step in. It is, we just cannot play Russian roulette with this sort of stuff. So I think firstly, NATO must flex its muscles. Putin recognizes strength. However dangerous people might think it. Actually, we need to flex our muscles. We need to get people like the Chinese, and President Xi is one of the few people that actually Putin listens to. And the Russians are absolutely reliant on the Chinese and the Indians to sell their oil to. So if the Chinese and Indians got involved, then we could have a demilitarized zone. The key thing is there is no military value to this area. If there was a 30-mile demilitarized zone around Zaporizhzhia, we could take that horrific nuclear catastrophe out of the equation. It should not affect, whatever the Russians are doing, and it shouldn't affect the Ukrainian defense. There is absolutely no reason for the status quo to come on. So this is a chance for big leaders like the Chinese and the Indians to really step up here, because the UN, unfortunately, nobody will allow the UN to do it, but the others might have a chance.
And Hamish, why should the Chinese step up? Why should India step up? What's in it for them?
Well, it's to prevent a nuclear catastrophe that, although at the moment a lot of the contamination will probably go westwards, it could go eastwards. And that would not only affect Russia, but elsewhere. But one would hope, some of the rhetoric coming out of Delhi, coming out of Beijing, looking for some resolution to this issue. If things went badly at Zaporizhzhia and we had some sort of nuclear event, this could turn Europe into a battlefield. because I can't believe that NATO can stand back if this did happen. So it is time for world leaders to step up to this. And unfortunately, because of the way the Russians are, I don't think they'll allow the UN in. NATO could threaten to put boots on the ground to protect Zaporizhzhia. That might escalate the situation, but it is a chance for some of the neutral, in inverted commas, countries like India and China to do some good and try and help resolve this desperate situation at the moment.
Well, look, it's a very serious situation, and thanks very much for coming on and explaining things to us. That's Hamish De Bretton-Gordon, who's a defence analyst and a former British Army colonel.
That explosion was from a secondary Russian strike in the Ukrainian city of Zaporizhzhia on Friday. Russia fired 5 missiles in 2 separate strikes about 40 minutes apart, killing at least 3 people and damaging several residential buildings and an industrial facility, according to the regional governor. The blast hit as media crews were filming damage from the first round of strikes. 13 people were wounded, including a young boy and 2 journalists. 4 people were hospitalized in grave condition. Ukraine's Air Force issued a ballistic missile raid alert for the region, part of which is occupied by Russia. Moscow has recently stepped up its usage of the weapons, which are harder to intercept. Earlier, Russian officials accused Ukraine of attacking the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, which is located southwest of the city and occupied by Russian troops. Reuters could not independently verify the claim.